Around the year 1200 BCE, something extraordinary happened. Across the eastern Mediterranean, some of the most powerful and sophisticated societies on Earth began to fail almost at the same time. Great cities were abandoned, palaces burned, writing systems disappeared, long-distance trade collapsed. These were not fragile societies. They were wealthy, organized, and deeply interconnected. As Dr. Eric Klein famously noted, this was a globalized world, bound together by a tin and bronze economy as complex as our own oil and silicon world today. Kings ruled from fortified palaces, defended by elite chariot corps, the ultimate high-tech weapon of the age. Ships crossed seas carrying metals and luxury goods over thousands of kilometers. And then, within a few decades, it was over. Historians once blamed invaders. Now we look at deeper scars, a mega-drought that lasted centuries, the silent creep of a pandemic plague, and a military system that simply ran out of bronze. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so unsettling is not just the destruction, it is how sudden it appears. One moment, this world is exchanging letters and gifts. The next, it has fallen silent. This is the story of how a connected world failed, and why the answer to what caused it is more complicated and more revealing than it first appears. To understand how this world fell, we first have to understand how it worked. We have to go back to the height of the International Age, a time when the Mediterranean was more like a single beating heart than a collection of separate kingdoms. By around 1300 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was operating at a level of coordination that would not be seen again for centuries. As Dr. Eric Klein emphasizes in his research, this was the first truly global economy. From the fortified citadels of mainland Greece to the great cities of Anatolia, from the ports of the Levant to the temples of Egypt, powerful kingdoms were bound together by regular contact and mutual dependence. This was not simply cultural influence drifting across borders. It was an international system. Kings knew one another by name. They exchanged letters, gifts, and royal marriages. This was the era of the Great Powers Club: Egypt, the Hittites, the Assyrians, and the Mycenaeans, who maintained a fragile peace through constant communication. They relied on shared expectations about diplomacy, trade, and stability. Disputes were negotiated within a familiar framework. Alliances were reinforced through ritual and reciprocity. At the center of this world were palace societies. In places like Mycenae, Pylos, Hattusa, and Ugarit, political authority, economic organization, and military power were concentrated in royal complexes. These palaces did not merely govern, they managed production. The palace was the brain of the state, and its primary muscle was the chariot corps. These chariots were the apex technology of 1300 BCE, the tanks of the ancient world. They required a massive investment, skilled wheelwrights, bronze for the axle fittings, and a constant supply of trained horses and silver. As long as the trade routes were open, these chariots made the great powers invincible. They collected grain, oil, livestock, textiles, and metals from surrounding regions, stored them, recorded them, and redistributed them to support administrators, craftsmen, soldiers, and elites. Power flowed through storage and allocation. Writing existed largely to serve this system. In Mycenaean Greece, linear B tablets tracked rations, equipment, landholdings, and labor obligations. They were not literature or philosophy. They were inventory. Their very existence reflects a world where resources moved through central points and were carefully monitored. But this inventory hides a darker reality. Recent bioarchaeological evidence suggests that beneath the surface, the population was already vulnerable. Traces of Yersinia pestis, the plague, have been found in human remains from this era, suggesting that even at its peak, the system was battling a silent enemy that thinned out the labor force required to keep the palaces running. The true scale of this international system is found in their diplomacy. The Amarna letters, written earlier but reflecting long-standing practices, show kings addressing one another as equals. In these clay tablets, the king of Babylon writes to the pharaoh of Egypt not as a rival, but as family.
Say to Nimmu-Warea, the king of Egypt, my brother, thus Kadeshman-Enlil, the king of Karaduniash, your brother, for me all indeed goes well, for you, for your household, your wives, and for your sons, your country, your chariots, your horses, your magnates may all go very well.
They negotiate marriages, complain about insufficient gifts, apologize for delays, and reaffirm alliances. The tone is formal, sometimes petty, but rarely anxious. It is the language of an elite club that assumed this world, and their status within it, would last forever. This is a world that assumes continuity. Trade made that continuity possible. Copper flowed from Cyprus in enormous quantities. Timber came from the Levant. Grain moved from fertile plains. Finished goods left palace workshops. Tin, the critical ingredient that turned copper into bronze, traveled from far beyond the Mediterranean. The distances involved were vast, but the routes were established and maintained. One shipwreck, discovered near Uluburun off the southern coast of Anatolia, captures this system in a single moment. Its cargo included copper ingots, tin, glass, ivory, precious metals, and luxury objects from multiple regions. Nothing about this cargo suggests improvisation. It reflects planning, coordination, and confidence that the journey was worth the risk. But the strength of this system concealed a vulnerability. Palace economies were efficient, but they were brittle. They depended on surplus. Good harvests were not optional. They were foundational. Surplus allowed rulers to smooth over bad years, provision armies, reward loyalty, and maintain order. Without surplus, the system had no margin. In the decades after 1300 BCE, the first pressure came from the environment. Across the eastern Mediterranean, climate conditions began to shift. Scientific evidence preserved in pollen cores from northern Syria shows a decline in cereal crops and a rise in plants adapted to drier conditions. Similar pollen samples from Cyprus indicate a sharp reduction in rainfall, severe enough to threaten basic agriculture. In parts of Greece, botanical remains show a gradual move toward vegetation better suited to dry environments. According to Dr. David Kanievsky, who led the landmark studies on these environmental shifts, this wasn't just a bad season, it was a mega drought that lasted for centuries. His research into ancient pollen grains tells us that the climate became so dry that the agricultural foundations of the Bronze Age literally withered away. These changes did not announce themselves as catastrophe. They unfolded slowly, over decades. But they altered a delicate balance. Harvests became less predictable. Bad years became more frequent. The buffer that palace systems relied on began to shrink. At the same time, some settlements thinned out or were abandoned without evidence of attack, pointing to internal stress rather than conquest. For a time, the system absorbed the strain. Palaces still functioned. Trade continued. Diplomacy remained routine. But resilience was being lost slowly. The first place where that loss became visible was food. Palace societies were designed to redistribute abundance, not manage prolonged scarcity. When grain stores ran low, rulers faced limits they could not easily overcome. They could not simply produce more food. They depended on neighboring regions to make up the difference. At the same time, the biological world may have turned against them. Contemporary Hittite records describe a devastating plague that ravaged their lands for 20 years. This was likely a pandemic, possibly tularemia or an early form of the bubonic plague, that thinned out the labor force, killed off key administrators, and made it impossible to harvest the crops that were already struggling due to the drought. When a system is already starving, a pandemic acts as a massive accelerant to its decay. It's here that we see the perfect storm theory proposed by archaeologist Dr. Eric Klein. He argues that no single event killed the Bronze Age. Instead, it was a concatenation of disasters. The most terrifying layer of that storm was the total breakdown of the food supply. By around 1220 BCE, this dependence appears clearly in the written record. Letters that once focused on diplomacy and exchange begin to speak urgently about grain. The most terrifying of these comes from the Hittite king to the city of Ugarit. The language is no longer the polite talk of brothers. It is a desperate scream for survival.
It is a matter of life or death. You must send this grain. Otherwise, the land of the Hittites will perish.
The confidence of earlier correspondence is gone. Another letter, from the city of Amar on the Euphrates, is even starker. It warns that famine has entered households and that without immediate help, the population will not survive. It reads like a last appeal. These texts matter because they show famine reaching the highest levels of power. When kings are writing like this, conditions among ordinary people are almost certainly worse. Food scarcity did more than cause hunger. It undermined authority. Palace systems depended on their ability to redistribute resources. Grain-fed workers, provisioned soldiers, supported administrators, and reinforced loyalty. When surplus disappeared, that leverage vanished with it. Rulers could no longer guarantee rations. Soldiers still needed to be fed. Officials still needed support. But the resources were no longer there. Archaeology reflects this weakening in subtle ways. In parts of Mycenaean Greece, palace centers begin to contract before they are destroyed or abandoned. Storage facilities shrink. Elite material culture thins. Administrative activity declines. The pattern is uneven, but the direction is consistent. As authority weakened, people began to move. Some settlements were abandoned without signs of violence. There are no burn layers, no collapsed walls, no weapons scattered in streets. Instead, there is absence. Movement worsened the crisis. When people left farmland and towns, agricultural output declined further. Fewer hands meant fewer harvests. What began as environmental stress became a self-reinforcing failure. Late Bronze Age trade was not a free market operating independently of political power. It depended on states to secure routes, protect ports, provision ships, and enforce agreements. As authority weakened and populations moved, trade became riskier and less predictable. This mattered because the late Bronze Age depended on materials that could not be sourced locally. Bronze was the backbone of the system. Tools, weapons, armor, and farming equipment all relied on it. Copper was available in several regions, though difficult to mine. Tin was not. Tin deposits were rare, unevenly distributed, and often thousands of kilometers away. Supplying tin required stable conditions across vast distances. Mines had to function. Routes had to remain open. Ports had to be secure. Ships had to be provisioned. As famine spread and instability grew, those conditions began to fail. Dr. Eric Klein often notes that the late Bronze Age was globalized in a way we wouldn't see again until the modern era. Because of this, the loss of trade routes created a chariot gap. Bronze Age warfare was built around the chariot, an incredibly expensive, high-tech weapon that required specialized wood, bronze fittings, and highly trained horses. When the trade routes failed, the empires couldn't build or repair their tanks, leaving them defenseless against the lighter, faster raider groups moving through the Mediterranean. Mining operations became harder to sustain. Transport routes grew unsafe. Ports lost protection. Even small disruptions were enough to halt supply. Archaeologically, this appears as a gradual reduction in bronze artifacts after around 1200 BCE. Bronze does not disappear overnight, but its availability declines. Tools wear out. Weapons become harder to replace. Defensive capacity shrinks. The structure of the system made failure contagious. Many regions no longer produced what they needed locally. They specialized. Some focused on raw materials. Others depended almost entirely on imports. There was little redundancy and no easy substitute. As long-distance trade broke down, failure became visible in the physical landscape. Ports that once handled steady traffic fell quiet. Fewer ships meant fewer supplies arriving from afar, and fewer ways to compensate for local shortages. What had once made the system efficient now worked against it. The archaeological record reflects this tightening crisis. In several regions, layers dating to the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE show signs of neglect before outright destruction. Buildings are repaired less often. Storage facilities are not rebuilt. Public spaces shrink. These are not the marks of sudden conquest. They are the marks of societies running out of capacity. At the same time, violence becomes harder to ignore. Across mainland Greece, parts of Anatolia, and the Levant, cities show clear destruction layers dating to roughly the same period. Walls collapse, buildings burn. Some sites are never reoccupied. Others are resettled only much later, on a smaller scale. The pattern is uneven, but the trend is unmistakable. However, modern researchers like Jesse Millick have pointed out that we shouldn't picture a single wave of fire. Millick's work shows that many of these destructions were actually gradual. Some cities weren't sacked by invaders. They were simply abandoned as the system failed. This suggests the Sea Peoples weren't a massive army of conquerors, but rather, as Dr. Eric Klein puts it, refugees who were as much victims of the collapse as they were its cause. It is at this stage that Egyptian sources describe attacks by groups collectively labeled as the Sea Peoples. They are depicted arriving by land and sea, accompanied by families and possessions as well as weapons. They are not described as a single nation, but as a collection of groups moving together. The question that has long divided scholars is whether these groups caused the collapse or were themselves a product of it. The archaeological evidence suggests the latter. The Sea Peoples appear most clearly at a moment when the system is already failing. Food supplies are unreliable. Trade routes are fragile. States are weakened internally. We can see the exact moment this ambiguity turned into catastrophe in the final letters of the city of Ugarit. As the Sea Peoples appeared on the horizon, the king of Ugarit sent a frantic plea to the king of Cyprus, begging for help that would never come.
My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. All my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca. The country is abandoned to itself.
This letter was found in a kiln, likely being fired for delivery at the very moment the city was destroyed. It is a chilling time capsule of the collapse, the last words of a civilization that had run out of time. In such conditions, migration becomes more likely. Some groups raid, others settle. The distinction is not always clear. Natural forces may have compounded the crisis further. Geological evidence suggests increased seismic activity across the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Earthquakes damaged cities in Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant. In isolation, earthquakes were survivable. These regions had experienced them before, but survival depended on the ability to rebuild. In a world already weakened by famine, depopulation, and trade disruption, rebuilding was often impossible. An earthquake that might once have been a setback became a final blow. Greece appears to have been hit particularly hard. Egypt, by contrast, was less affected. By around 1200 BCE, the international system that had once bound the eastern Mediterranean together ceased to function. diplomatic correspondence dries up. Trade networks fragment, palace centers disappear. Writing systems vanish in some regions entirely. In Greece, linear B tablets stop abruptly. Around 1177 BCE, Egypt confronts the crisis directly. During the reign of Ramesses III, Egyptian forces repel attacks attributed to the Sea Peoples. The events are commemorated at Medinet Habu. Egypt survives. But survival is not recovery. Egypt never regains the position it once held in the international system. The age of the great powers was over. Even though Egypt repelled the Sea Peoples, the chariot age had ended, and the plague-weakened population could no longer sustain the massive monumental building projects of the past. Long-distance trade does not return to its previous scale. The economic logic of the Bronze Age is gone. Elsewhere, the transformation is stark. In Greece, palaces vanish and writing disappears for centuries. Communities become smaller and more local. In Anatolia, the Hittite state collapses completely. Iron begins to replace bronze, not because it is superior, but because it is more accessible in a fragmented world. If this is stripped to its essentials, the Bronze Age collapse does not begin with invasion. It begins with the environment. As the Eastern Mediterranean became drier and more unpredictable, harvests failed more often. Surplus shrank. And once surplus disappeared, the palace systems that held these societies together began to weaken. Food shortages undermined authority. Rulers could no longer reliably feed populations or maintain order. People began to move. Some cities thinned out. Others were abandoned quietly as large urban centers stopped making sense. Disease spread through populations already under stress, further hollowing out societies from within. That internal weakening made everything else fragile. Long-distance trade failed. Tin became harder to obtain. Bronze production slowed. The chariot armies that defined elite power could no longer be maintained. Earthquakes damaged cities that no longer had the labor or resources to rebuild. What might once have been temporary setbacks became permanent losses. Only then do migrations and raids appear clearly in the record. Groups later called the Sea Peoples moved through a world that was already failing. They did not break a stable system. They accelerated one already in collapse. Egypt survived, but the international system did not. Trade, diplomacy, and scale never return. The Bronze Age did not end because of one cause. It ended because a highly interconnected system lost its ability to absorb shock. It did not collapse overnight. It unraveled.